Hey guys, how's it going? Okay, so today we're going to start our Mountain Men unit. But before we do, I want you to know what to expect from this. So you're going to go over this no more than 15 minutes. It'll be pretty short. After this, you are going to go and take a little quiz. The quiz is just going to make sure that you listened, make sure that you paid attention. So if you want to have a piece of paper and notes, I would suggest it. That would be a great idea. And then we will move on to that whole movement west. So let's back up a little bit. We talked earlier this week about the first person to come into Utah. Do you remember who the first person coming into Utah was? Juan Rivera. He was like, oh, hey, welcome to be the first non-native into Utah. Hey, how's it going? Oh, you're just kind of looking around for some silver. Cool. Okay, see ya. And then he's gone. Dominguez and Escalante managed to find their way into Utah, managed to talk to the Utes, managed to have some lasting impacts on us. But they weren't intending on coming here. They didn't come here on purpose. That was not their intent when they left New Mexico, and they didn't stay for very long. So Mountain Men are the first people to come into Utah purposefully. This was their intent, was to come here and live here. And they stayed. They stayed for longer than a couple of weeks or a month. They stayed here for years and years, and a lot of them lived their whole entire life here. Even after this whole the trapping boom was over, they decided to stay here. Okay, so what exactly is a mountain man? What did they do? What was their job? Well, their job was trapping. A trapper is exactly what it sounds like. It's someone who trapped animals for a living. They specifically during this time hunted beaver. So what is it about beaver that made them come here to trap it? Kind of cute, but kind of rodent-ish too. So not like something that I would go out of my way to find. So what do you think? Why would they come here just for that? Well, let me tell you, this is 1800s. Think Abe Lincoln in his top hat, and that is what you've got. You've got fashion. The fashion of the time says you need a hat made out of a beaver pelt. Okay, so why in the world would you need a hat made out of a beaver pelt? What's specific to a beaver pelt that would make it superior to any other kind of pelt? Well, a beaver pelt's going to be waterproof. This is high fashion. This is high fashion in England and in America. In England, they're an island right off the ocean. They are consistently in rainy weather. So they want something to cover their head that's going to keep that water off of their head. So this was like the best thing that they could think of. So what they would do is they would get these really thick beaver pelts in order to do it. Now, if you want a really thick beaver pelt, what time of the year do you think that you'd be catching and trapping it? Think for a minute of all the animals that you have around or that you see around. When do animals have the thickest fur, the thickest coat all year round? In the winter. That's when it gets thicker because that's when they need to be warmer. So they would do most of their trapping in the cold season. We'll come back to that. But this is why they're doing it, is it's high fashion. Okay, there's two groups of people. Well, really three, but we're going to start with two. Two groups of people who are dying to get their hands on these beaver pelts. The first are the British. The British are the fur company from the British is called the Hudson Bay Company. So they're the ones who said, hey, we want to sell these hats. These hats are going to make us so much money. Let's create our own company and we'll hire these trappers to go out into this untamed wilderness. And from there, they'll have to sell us all of it. Okay, so that's kind of the idea behind it. They're the first group to do this. There's the first company to hire these mountain men, these trappers, to go out specifically to trap for them. So, some examples of this were Peterskane, Ogden. Sound like a familiar place? It should. Also, I would remember this name. Okay, British trappers worked for Hudson Bay Company. Okay, British trappers for Hudson Bay Company. The other company we're going to talk about is the Ashley Henry Fur Company. This is the American counterpart. They are the American trappers. They're the ones who worked for this American company. Now, people from America could work for Ashley Henry, but they also sent people over from Europe to come and hunt and trap directly for them. What's cool about the Ashley Henry Fur Company is they are the first to come up with this idea of supply caravan. So they're the first ones who are like, these guys are going to need a lot of things to survive out there if we only go out and see them once a year. So let's send multiple wagons at once so that they can all go together, they can all help protect each other if they're to get attacked, and go from there. Okay, next up. He's Jedediah Smith. So you guys have heard the name Jedediah Smith, and that is an example of someone who worked for Ashley Henry. We'll talk about him here in a minute. Last up, we have this group of people, not just one guy, but this group of people who didn't want to work for either company. They're like, well, if I work for myself, then at the end of the year when we sell all of our stuff, the end of their year, not like a calendar year, they can sell it to whoever will pay them more. Sometimes this worked out great for them. Sometimes it bit them in the butt. Like if they had enough pelts that they weren't paying that much, then they lost money. Okay, so they're a group that worked for themselves, not for a company. Some examples. Etienne Provost. This, how they say it in French, is Etienne Provost. They kind of leave off the ST. And Etienne in French translate to Steve. So Steve Provost and Joseph Walker. Okay, so they're free trappers. When they are done, when they have this together, then they get to go sell it once a year. But let's talk about these trappers themselves. When you are talking about trappers, what kind of lifestyle do they live? They don't have friends. They don't have anyone to hang out with, because if you're living that close to someone, they're going to trap all of your beaver. And you don't want that. So they live a very, very solitary lifestyle. So these trappers would live this super solitary lifestyle without anyone else around. They did not want to see anyone else around. They did not want to have neighbors popping in. So how this picture has the guy with all the pelts on the outside, this is not how it was all the time. In fact, they very rarely kept their pelts and their goods there with them in case they came to steal it. Okay. Another thing, this is a super dangerous lifestyle. There's all sorts of hazards that they come. If you're by yourself in the forest and you live in there by yourself and you get hurt, there's no one there to help you. You got to figure it out or you die. If you get an infection, you die. If you run out of food, you die. If you get attacked by a bear, you die. You get the point. There's a lot of things that can kill you. Okay, so do they want to hire trappers that have a huge family that are waiting to hear from them? No, absolutely not. Because if they do, and their family is asking the company, what happened to my kid? What happened to my brother? They don't want that. So they intentionally sought after orphans, to hire orphans. It was a very solitary lifestyle. There was a couple of times where that wouldn't happen, where they'd actually get to see people. The biggest time that happened was at a rendezvous. The rendezvous is where they would go and sell everything that they've trapped for the entire year. So fall, winter, and spring, they would trap. They would do their work. But you're looking for the thickest beaver pelt you can have. So summertime is not the time that you want to be hunting them. Plus, they need to repopulate a little bit. And that's when they're going to be doing that kind of stuff too. So they will be working during all of those cold months, fall, winter, spring. As soon as it warms up, then they're done. That's when they go and they clean out all of their caches. Cache is spelled like Cache Valley. What's a cache? So this picture in the bottom corner is kind of a modern day cache. There is no such thing as a bed frame that they would use. But a cache is a hiding place in the woods, a secret hiding place where they would keep all of their pelts. That way, if another trapper happened to run upon a different trapper's cabin, if you just saw a cabin sitting there, no one to be seen, and it had 50 beaver pelts sitting there, they'd probably take them. So you didn't leave your pelts where you lived. You hid them in caches surrounding where only you knew where they were. That way, if you needed that way no one could take it from you. During the summertime, they would go and clean out these caches, and they would go and meet the fur companies and the Native Americans at this time when they called it a rendezvous. So a rendezvous is essentially a giant party. This is where they would sell all of their pelts. Money didn't really do you any good if you were living with no one else in sight. So not only did these companies not have to pay them cash, they would just trade them, but they would trade it at a higher value than what they paid for. So that means that they would make money off of the pelts and off of these goods. So they really did very well during this time frame. So they would trade all of their goods. They would trade more than just beaver pelts. The mountain men would get any sort of food they wanted, flour, sugar, anything like that, plus any modern civilization good from the time that they couldn't make themselves. They also had music and dancing. It was a giant party. They would play games together. And this party continued on for weeks at a time until the whiskey was gone. Okay, so this was a rendezvous. This is how they celebrated every year. It was kind of the last hurrah before the season started up again. Okay, this all obviously had to come to an end. So what happened? What were these main two triggers that ended it? These are kind of big ones. The first one, all the beaver had been trapped. There was practically no beaver left in the entire state or surrounding area of Utah, which is insane. Okay, they almost just completely took them out of the ecosystem. Okay, so that was the first one. Second, fashion changed. What was fashionable 10 years ago is not something that you'd be wearing today. I know it all comes back around again, but top hats have not come back again. So this was no longer fashionable. So if it's not fashionable and the end user isn't buying it, then that company is not going to buy the pelts from the mountain men. So we've got a couple of big things a couple of big resonating impacts that these mountain men left on the future settlers of Utah. First, trails. They created trails. Just look at that map of all the trails the mountain men and trappers created. They were literally called trailblazers. Trailblazers is like the name of a car and a name of someone who does something that's never been done before. Okay, so trailblazers. Next, they created maps. They left journals, and they themselves became guides. They knew this land like the back of their hand. So as people are wanting to come and settle, then they would just show them how to get there. They'd take them the easy way through. They'd say, no, you don't want to go there. This is a terrible time of year to go through there because it floods. Okay, they knew the ins and outs of it, and they were able to smoothly guide people past that. Okay, next, they had these really great relations with Native Americans. This is the same concept with Dominguez and Escalante, where there is a good relationship with the Native Americans. Because Dominguez and Escalante had a good relationship, then the mountain men could. Because the mountain men have a good relationship with the Native Americans, it sets the settlers up in a really, really good way. They traded. If something happened and all of a sudden the mountain men found themselves without any supplies, they ran out of flour or something got into their meat and they needed food, they could go and trade at any point with the Native Americans, who also lived out there full time, obviously, and they could do what they needed to do to get by. So they had these really good, awesome relationships. So those are three really important impacts that the mountain men had on future settlers of Utah.